Andie, it's so wonderful seeing your face in the flesh, talking to you again. Thank you for coming back on Where Hope Grows. You know, I think of you as such a brilliant mind. You are creative. You have incredible information with your newsletter and Substack, which I very much enjoy reading as a consumer. You also are highly skilled with a microscope. So I don't know how many hours of your day you look at a microscope, but how much you understand the complexities of what is smaller than the eye can see astonishes me. And you're a fantastic educator. You do compost classes and lessons and consultation. You're going to be presenting at this year's What Good Shall I Do conference, which I'm so excited about. And so all this is incredible to me. And one thing that really stuck with me is the last time we talked, you just said, sometimes you feel like you have imposter syndrome, where you don't necessarily feel like you belong in this regenerative movement or community or agricultural space sometimes. And I just think that's a really interesting starting point, because the way that I see you externally is differently than the way maybe you perceive yourself. But let's just start there. What is it about all these amazing accomplishments and the disconnect between how I perceive you as an expert and then sometimes where you doubt yourself as being a part of this community?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thank you for all of those generous thoughts that you shared. That does make me feel like I belong in a lot of ways. I think where the imposter syndrome stems from is that I didn't grow up in a rural context. I didn't grow up raising, even really gardening. But my upbringing, if I really think about it, my suburban neighborhood backed up to a nature center, and I loved being out there, and I'd go out there any chance we could get. And so that to me is where I pull from in my adult life and in my profession, this inherent longing to participate in this movement is from those early experiences that I know were when I felt most aligned, so to speak, with my environment.
Yeah. For me, my greatest fear is that there's other people out in the world who have their own unique skill set, their own superpower like you, but don't pursue the path that you've pursued because maybe they don't have family access to hundreds of acres or livestock or market garden. But they have this pull and this urge to participate and to be in relationship with the earth, but they just say, well, that's not for me. I'm not blessed to have that opportunity. And so for you, did you see yourself going this direction in life as a young child, or how did you arrive at this point?
As a young child, I was really obsessed with watching Discovery Channel shows that are all about nature. And I really admired the scientists that they would bring on that would break down all these really complicated things that were happening inside the human body or in the ecology. And then being able to share that with a 10-year-old like me in my living room and to have me make sense of it. That was something that really has been a consistent interest of mine is, I guess, science communication. So in that regard, I imagined myself doing this, but I didn't really know what it would look like. And I'm still figuring that out all the time, Sometimes I dream about getting into ranching or getting into farming more directly. But right now, it just makes the most sense with where I'm at in life and with the resources that I have to participate in the ways that I currently am, which is primarily through communications and through composting and things that I can do in my current environment, which is a very suburban landscape.
Yeah. Last time I checked in, I think something like less than 2% of Americans are actually on land. Boots on the ground, managing livestock or managing large tracts, growing plants. And so if we have this idea that being a part of this agricultural community or this regenerative movement is only for that 2% or less of the U.S. population, I think that really limits how big this can be. And so you're like a living example of someone who's like, you know what, I'm going to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And I'm going to figure it out. I'm also inspired by, there's this quote, and I don't remember who it's from, but something along the lines of if humans are going to change their behavior, change our consciousness, decide to create with Earth in a way that's healing and nourishing, it's not going to come from like world governments. It's not going to come from technocrats or billionaires or elites. It's going to come from like people like you, me, Morgan over there, and like I don't even want to say average normal people, but like people who like lead with their heart.
Yeah.
And so thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. So if you don't have access to land and like you're on this trajectory, or maybe like you're already pursuing another career path, but you have this calling to connect greater to Earth, to planet. What are some options? Like, what can you explore?
Yeah. When I was thinking about all the different ways that you could get involved in this movement, I was reminded of these 3 different types of stewardship. So there's the doer, and I'll go through each one of these, but there's the doer, the donors, and the practitioners.
You said donors?
Donors.
Wait, spell that?
DONORS, like the financial donors.
Oh, yes, okay.
So doers, donors, and practitioners. And the doers are generally like the volunteers, the people that show up to, in this context, like maybe on-farm volunteering. Maybe they volunteer for policy campaigns that are relevant to this movement, support a conference relevant to this movement. Conferences usually require some amount of volunteers to help with registration or whatever it is. Donors providing financial support, but also like purchasing power. So not just direct donations to different organizations, but choosing to purchase regenerative meat, for example, is kind of the donor role. And then there's practitioners, which includes a lot of different people. Includes people like you who are directly ranching and on the land. Includes people like me who are more in the communication, education space. It could also include researchers, policymakers, and this is where I think people can also be included day to day. Like this could include someone just implementing regenerative principles in their daily lives, and soil health principles in whatever land they have access to, even if that's a potted plant or if it's a 1/4 acre lot. That is an area where people probably aren't tapping into. They're probably contained. They've contained their stewardship to the donor role using their purchasing power. I think that's where a lot of us start, and that's a great thing. That's a great place to start. But if we can start thinking about like, what are other ways that I can get involved in this movement?
Yeah. So if I think about regeneration, it does feel like something that's outcome based. It's more external, and there's a lot happening internal at a microscopic level. I want to talk to you about that, but when you touched on incorporating regenerative principles into your own life, maybe as like a starting point or a catalyst or foundation to build from, what are regenerative principles in your daily lives?
That's a good question, because like I know the soil health principles like the back of my hand now, but regenerative principles are a little more I guess personalized, and there might actually be regenerative principles written down somewhere to be really objective, but I think inherently they kind of have to be subjective to the individual in order for them to be meaningful. So for me, regenerative principles might include my relationship with food and the culture I have around food is a huge one for me. There's, with the culture around food, what I really mean is like when you sit down and commune with people over food, like that's a regenerative principle. It seems really abstract, but there's something about that connects us to food and where it's sourced from and our own bodies too. But so many times, because we eat 3 times a day, if we're eating 3 times a day, we're doing it pretty quickly generally. So I like to start just really simple and say 1 meal of the day I'm going to consume consciously, like as a starting point. 1 ingredient I'm going to like actually just take a brief moment to think about like where it came from and connect with it, because those are the changes that can really impact where you go next, like with your decision making, is when you're actually consciously bringing awareness to the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we do a lot of that at our house too. And even just saying like a prayer of gratitude before the meal and like going around the table and sharing that together, it creates that sense of community, a sense of being a part of something that's bigger than just us at the table, but always, just obviously being incredibly in admiration and show maximum reverence for that food or the animal specifically. In my context, that sacrificed this life to nourish your body.
Right.
To live that.
Yeah. And even if it's like, okay, let's say you're eating chicken that you got at the grocery store, you're not so sure about where that came from. You might not necessarily feel super excited about like that ingredient. But if you picked some mint out of your own garden and it's incorporated into the meal, like sit with the connection of that. Like don't let perfection stand in your way of feeling that sense of connection, because I think that's the source of our displacement, is like we're already pretty disconnected. And so for constantly, for people that are interested in living more regeneratively or being part of this movement, I think that is an opportunity for imposter syndrome to come in when you're looking at a plate of food and you're criticizing half the stuff on it instead of connecting with the things that do align with you.
Yeah. When you look at, I think a lot lately about what's above, so is below, like this idea or this concept of like the macroscopic is representative of the microscopic, or they're interchangeable. You obviously spend a lot of time looking under a microscope.
Yeah.
What do you like? What lessons are there, or kind of principles? Like if you're looking at soil, how is what's happening at the microscopic level representative of what's happening at the greater scale?
Definitely biodiversity. So if there's little biodiversity on the land, there's very little biodiversity on the soil. But what's really important to realize is that if you inform the soil of more biodiversity, then that can help the above ground experience more biodiversity. So often, because we're so used to looking at things with our own eyes and we can't see the below ground, we think we think the above ground is what like controls the health of the soil, but it's not. Like they're interrelated. Like one can affect the other, so it's a two-way street. And when I look at soils on the microscope and I see very little biodiversity, we can change that by affecting the microbes themselves, but also changing the vegetation that's above ground. So it's kind of both. And then, yeah, what other insights do I find from soil under the microscope? I think just life in general, like it's always a wonder, like when you put this thing that looks lifeless under the microscope and see how alive it really is. And I always have this moment where like I'm wiping the slide clean and I'm like, wow, that's so weird that I was just marveling at all of this microbial life and now I have to like clean the slide and kill them, you know?
But like asteroid hitting their community.
Yeah. But that just goes to show that like I have compassion for living things, and that's a good thing. So any chance I get, I try to rinse a slide into a potted plant or do something like that. Which is, these are small things, but it represents the greater sense of connection that we have with other life forms.
I love that. Have you arrived at this level in your understanding or your appreciation for life at the microscopic level to where you're able to, like say, for example, stand in any given field, eyes closed, maybe eyes open, but just stand there and perceive, maybe energetically or with some other sense, and make a prediction of what that field is going to look like under a microscope?
Yes, actually. And I'm not nearly as experienced as many of my peers, but I feel like I've looked at enough contexts that I know what to expect a lot of the times from the above ground observations. now there is nuance there, especially when you're in transition of going from something that was very conventionally managed and transitioning. We do look for that's really what the microscope is useful for, is like those detailed nuances. What I've found the microscope most useful for is actually evaluating composts. And now I'm getting to a point where I can ask enough questions about somebody's compost management or compost process, the feedstocks they put into it and how they managed it, and get a general sense of whether or not it's going to look really vibrant and biodiverse or not.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So compost, maybe it's looking at compost, or maybe it's looking at a field or a plot of land. What are the cues that give you confidence that things are moving in the right direction, or that there's a underlying soil health that is thriving? And like, how do you measure? Like, do you take off your shoes? Do you touch the soil? Or is it just visual, auditory, smell? Like, how are you doing that?
Yeah. I'm still evolving in this and challenging myself to become less of a scientist and more in tune with the physical realm of just observation. And yeah, I think there's, the smell is actually one of the things that I think you can train yourself over time to really perceive in a more detailed way. Like if you've ever heard about how people train to become like wine, how people like smell wine and they tell the person who's making it to like
Yes.
change the levers and all
I'm
that.
okay with saying that word wrong.
Oh.
I say it all the time.
Oh, what
is it? Sauvignon?
Sommelier.
See, I just set the foundation.
Oh, of course, Morgan would know,
so y'all
right?
could say it right.
Okay, sommelier. Yeah, I called it a wine person.
I was like, is she nervous to say the word? Because I'll screw it up.
Yeah.
Sommelier.
I can see how it's spelled, but I could not venture to say it. Yeah, so in wine, you can train your nose, basically. And to you and me, like all of the wine samples would probably smell the same, but to a sommelier, like they would know all of those different nuances. And so you can kind of do the same thing with soil and compost. But yeah, I think it's about observing changes in the plant type too can be really informative. So the types of plant species that are growing in a really disturbed landscape versus a healing landscape versus like a truly regenerating landscape, like you're moving along in succession. And I'm sure you've seen that a lot on your ranch. And like plants do speak, the different species that will arise are just like in direct response to however we're managing the land. So I think that's a really powerful one and encourages me to keep getting better and better at my plant species identification skills.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure when you're like driving in rural areas, you're just like looking at landscape out the window. Oh, that guy's crushing it. Or like that farmer is doing it, could be doing better. We don't want to say horrible.
And
could be improving.
Half the time, I'm looking at dirt that's exposed or stubble, and I try not to have judgment because I just think like, why? Like, why are we doing that? Why is that person specifically doing that? Because knowing what I know, like, it can be really easy to be like, we should never do that and to demonize it and villainize it. But if so many folks are managing land that way, like there's a reason for it. And I think a lot of it does boil down to this cultural shift. And that's transferable to how we manage lawns and yards too.
Yeah. You wrote this one blog a long time ago, many moons ago, about that like perception of being mindful not to shame others who maybe have practices such as tilling, for example.
Right.
I just thought that was like so enlightening because, sometimes I go there too, and that's the wrong approach energetically because like, we want to change and we want to level up the whole agricultural system. When you come to someone with judgment and maybe eliciting a response of guilt or shame from them, it's like defense mode goes up immediately, shutting down. And not only shutting down, but doubling down what they're doing. And so it's like very divisive versus unifying.
Yeah. And as you were describing that dynamic between humans, I've also found myself doing that a lot myself in my immediate environment. So like in my yard, I'm like annoyed sometimes that it just it's not growing the things that I want it to grow or whatever. Even if I seed something and it won't grow, I find myself coming to the environment and being like, why aren't you regenerating yourself? And it's really like responding, saying like, well, you're not showing up energetically in the ways that I need you to, physically in the ways that I need you to. Like, I'm just doing my job here.
For sure. I'm glad you transitioned to yards, because I really wanted to talk about the urban context and the urban setting, and really like the catalyst. You did a like a Substack post about this too, which was really cool. But the genesis for this conversation for me is like, we have all these people coming out to Rome Ranch, who get it. Like, they love these principles of soil health. They want to co-create with nature. They want to be a part of this. But they're like, I don't have access to land like this, but what I do have is a yard. So like, light bulb goes off in their head. Tell me, what can I do to regenerate my yard?
Yeah.
And that's just so cool to hear people say that. And so like I couldn't think of someone better to have that conversation with. But before we go into like that elevated leveling up of what the potential of a urban landscape can look like, can you just touch on maybe like just like that stereotypical American dream, God bless USA, monoculture, coastal Bermuda,
yes,
landscape, and like, what does that look like to you? And then like, what are some of like the unintended consequences that we don't even perceive?
Yeah, I know this really well just from personal experience. So I haven't done a lot of research on like how there's a lot of history there, right? Of how we've gotten to this point of just culturally like valuing grass lawns and mowing and all of that goes into the maintenance of it, irrigating it. But firsthand, I live in a new development, so I've seen the excavation process, and then what happens when they bring in just a little bit of engineered topsoil and then lay down sod. And what I can gather is that like, it's, at least in today's world, it's the easiest thing for a builder to do. And thinking like a builder, right? Like, it's all about efficiency, and it's all about trying to cut costs and speed up your timeline, and et cetera. So it makes sense to me like why the sod is applied to these sites that have just been destroyed. Now, yeah, to paint a picture, like that's the scale of how many, I don't know if you got any stats on that, but like the scale of the amount of lawns we have in this country. Like, I've heard that the lawn grass is the most irrigated, quote unquote, crop in America. And that's really wild. I mean, think about all the irrigated crops in agriculture, from orchards to corn and wheat and even pasture land. Like, a lot of these spaces are irrigated to grow our food, and yet we're using a lot of that water on lawns and these manicured grasses that are doused with a lot of chemicals to keep them in this pristine green color and to keep them weed free. So those are the values seemingly of our culture in cities and suburban areas, is this kind of cookie cutter, aesthetically pleasing, allegedly.
I mean, it's so strange. And I have to imagine you've gone on the same journey, and this is the power of the human mind. But I remember growing up, my grandpa was like, had the most beautiful lawn in all of the neighborhood. And like every month, the group in Austin, so it was a pretty big deal, pretty big city, Austin, Texas. His house was like yard of the month one time. And it was like such perfectly groomed, manicured monoculture. I mean, like just so far from the context of how that ecosystem was hewn. But like there was a perceivable beauty that maybe we've been just educated or socialized to perceive. Whereas like when you kind of like shift slowly out at that moment and see like something a little bit less manicured, a little bit more native, a little bit more chaotic and biodiverse, like I remember thinking clearly the manicured lawn was more attractive aesthetically.
Mm-hmm.
But then also like this, like if you see pictures, there's screensavers on phones and computers where it's like this cornfield, like in rolling hills, one single species. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of pretty.
Yeah, there's something about it that's like, I don't know, there's something relaxing about it that you only have like this one thing to focus on. And like the diversity feels chaotic sometimes to our mind. I think like our minds like long for simplicity in some ways, and maybe aesthetically like taking that in feels soothing in a way.
Yeah. But I imagine like now like such a shift.
Right.
And so like, what do you perceive as beautiful now?
Oh, pollinators, flowers.
Right.
I mean, I've been letting our backyard, I have an HOA, of course. So like the front yard, I've been maintaining per these standards, but the backyard I've really just let, as an exercise for myself, just like let it go. And I'll mow when it, like I have to, I'm pretty exposed in the back. So like I'll mow when I really need to keep it, just contained a little bit. But it's an existential experience every time I mow, because I see all of this life, like the amount of grasshoppers and pollinators from butterflies to moths and bees, like they're humming in our lawn because we're letting the weeds flower. And I look over the fence and our neighbors, and this is no fault of theirs, but they are letting the sod do sod things, and they're letting their landscaping crew do landscaping things, and it's just dead. It's dead and dry, and there's no life there. So but I find our yard like really beautiful, especially during certain times of the year where there's just pollinators everywhere.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I mean, even it's so cool that in your context, like your front yard's a little bit more tame and then your backyard's more wild. And so it's like two control plots. And you perceive your backyard as just teeming with life and more abundant and more beautiful to your senses now, and mine too. For sure, I've evolved that way. But like when you're standing in your backyard versus spending time in your front yard, like is there perceivable differences in the noise, the energy, just like the frequency or something that's like undetectable, hard to measure?
I'll compare it to a lawn that does have like a lot of fertilizer and stuff being applied to it, because I don't partake in that at all. Like for the front yard, I just hand weed and hope for the best. I implement a lot of regenerative practices, which I'm sure we'll get to as well. But when I'm in like a turf field, whether it's like a golf course or a park or something like that, there's almost this, and it could just be my bias, right? But I honestly feel like I smell like there's a chemical smell sitting out picnicking in a lawn like that. And that does not feel good. And I think that's been an impetus for a lot of homeowners to start transitioning away from these heavy chemical usage and more towards at least organic methods of fertilizing. And I think that's a good thing. But yeah, who wants to sit or play or roll around in grass that's been, doused with a lot of these fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, which I think we've talked about, like acide means to kill. And we're trying to like live out there in these spaces, and we want to connect with other living things. But we're just kind of killing everything for the sake of this grass.
I think that's a good point. So if you have kids or dogs or like care about yourself, and I always kind of use that as like maybe a yellow flag if we're out at a public park and like I'm scanning the environment, kids have no shoes on, and there's not a single wildflower or weed in sight. That's kind of like a warning sign that there's probably a lot of those side chemicals that have been sprayed. And then in that case, it's like, sorry, girls, put your shoes on. Like I want to see that biodiversity, because that's a signal that the landscape has not been poisoned.
Right. Yeah, totally. I think that's a good rule of thumb.
So if we talk about like kind of the conventional mindset on how we manage our urban landscapes, doing a very, culturally, historically kind of relevant to really tidy. And we recognize that there's like unintended consequences. You touched on like the chemicals, maybe the water use, and then you could also say things like I don't know, like the travesty like bare soil, like broken water cycles, or just not infiltrating water with shallow roots. So there's all these bad unintended consequences. But then what about the potential of using artificial turf? Does that fix everything? Have you seen that?
Yeah. I've
Judgment
seen,
free.
Yeah. I actually have a lot of well-meaning friends that ask me a lot about quote unquote xeriscaping. And when I ask them what they mean by xeriscaping, and half the time it's called xeroscaping, like, what do you mean by that? Because like technically, if you were to ask like a horticulturalist, xeriscaping with an X is native plants and basically trying to, plant landscapes that are going to survive your conditions with like little to no irrigation or protection from freeze or whatever else, that requires a lot of input from us. And that I'm a fan of, right? But when I ask people, what do you mean by xeriscaping or xeroscaping? And they say, like, I want to put down rocks so that I don't have to water my lawn, and I'm going to put drought tolerant plants. And I'm like, we live in Central Texas. We don't live in a desert. Like it doesn't, it's going to help you cut down on irrigation, but it's not actually going to help the environment or your soil retain moisture. So there's a lot of different things we could be doing that align better with their desire than just covering. It's like the worst thing I think a homeowner could do, aside from leaving soil entirely bare, is to cover it with rocks, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so glad you touched on that. Unless contextually your ecosystem is hewn from like a desert environment.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking here in Central Texas, that breaks my heart. But if I saw that somewhere in a more desert environment, it's no big deal because that is within the context of that space.
Yep. I'm so much more mindful of the idea of landscapes where you just remove grass so you don't have to water, and then you put in a bunch of rock. Like nature will always, one of the principles is cover bare soil,
right?
Like when it's in the right context. And so like if I just see a perfectly xeroscape yard, I think either that person is going out there every day and removing things by hand, unlikely, or they're just dousing it with chemicals again.
Right.
So it's like another yellow flag where a lot of like public spaces, parks, breweries, even playgrounds, when there's just a shit ton of rocks, but there's no living organisms in the rocks.
Yeah.
That's like stranger danger.
Yeah.
Like ask some questions.
Yeah, for sure. And the artificial turf too, like is kind of got a movement. Yeah, I mean, I get that it doesn't require irrigation, so maybe like you could argue that it's better than your Bermuda grass, but I would argue that even your Bermuda grass is transpiring, like it's photosynthesizing, it's capable of feeding microbes, it's capable of supporting a soil food web. So I'd much rather have the Bermuda grass over artificial turf.
That's really cool. That's really good to hear. And so let's get into maybe some like creative ideas on how listeners and people can implement some regenerative practices at home. And I know there's like, I don't know how you think through this, but I'd be really curious to hear like, where do you start? And then like, kind of like walk me through some things that people can do.
Yeah, I would start with mulch. And mulch is basically ground cover, which is one of the first soil health principles. So I think of applying soil health principles to this context. In fact, I've heard people adding context itself as one of the soil health principles, and I think that's I love that. So to recap soil health principles: minimize disturbance, so that includes mechanical, chemical, physical disturbance. Keep soil covered, so that's where the mulching comes in. Keep a living root or active photosynthesis at all times if possible. Increase biodiversity. Livestock integration, which we can get to, because the last one is context. So having a bison on your quarter-acre lot, it probably isn't going to pan out very well, but there might be other ways that you can honor like the rationale behind that principle, behind livestock integration, but within a yard. So maybe a good way to do this is to just kind of go through each one of those principles and explain how I would do it in a yard.
I love it. Let's do it.
Okay, so minimizing disturbance, that one seems pretty obvious. Like you're no longer going to be using all of those asides, right? Get rid of your pesticide responsibly. You got to go take this stuff to hazardous household waste. No more pesticides, herbicides, or even synthetic fertilizers. All of those things really harm the soil life, and so you can't truly regenerate the soil using any of those. Any other minimize disturbance? Are there any other ones like?
Well, let me think about if someone is saying, well, I guess like mechanical disturbance would, I mean, like, what about someone who's just like, I'm going to mow my grass every week, even if it doesn't need it, even if it's not raining?
Yeah. That's a good one because that creates quite a bit of compaction without people realizing it. And even just like walking on it on a certain area, like over and over again, I think the best way to deal with that is to actually use some kind of stones for your feet to land on. And yeah, you're just sacrificing that area, but now you're not like impacting or potentially you're giving a designated walkway so that people aren't walking across the lawn in different ways all the time. So designated pathway can be a helpful way to minimize overall impact.
Sure. So if we're minimizing disturbance and you're also talking about removing chemical inputs, I imagine, especially in like that transition between a system that's been artificially propped up with synthetic inputs, that there's going to be like a really weird, it's not going to be like overnight, this beautiful lush yard. So two things that are going to freak people out probably, and maybe you could give some thoughts on like people are going to be maybe tolerant of the first dandelion that comes up because once they understand like, hey, it's serving a purpose. It's aesthetically pleasing when you change your perspective. Maybe a pollinator's friends with it. But what do you do about someone who's like, I don't want mosquitoes. I don't want scorpions in my yard.
Right.
Chiggers, ticks, like the undesirable pests or insects.
Right. Okay, there's a few things that come to mind. Thing one is to encourage you to be more curious about those things. So there's actually a practice that I'd recommend if you want to get more into like the mindset shifts. And that's like, this is a challenge. Okay. This isn't necessarily beginner level observation. This is like a challenge. If you're looking to challenge yourself, like go observe a wasp nest every day for a week. Like just once a day, step out there, observe it, maybe check on it in the morning, afternoon, and evening, or an anthill or a weed. Like pick something that like you don't like and try to sit with it and observe it, because like, with curiosity, that will change your relationship to that thing that you despise so much. And I'm not saying you're going to come to love it or whatever, but you'll at least have some respect for what's going on, right? And I think in the case of the dandelion, that's an easy thing to get curious about. Like, no, that dandelion's not trying to get into your home or hurt your kids or anything like that. Now, I understand, the fears around more aggressive insects or whatever getting into the home, but I would just challenge people to get more curious about their fear before they decide what to do about those risks.
That is so well said and beautiful. And one observation that I've made that's resonating with what you're saying is like wild pigs in general have just like such a negative connotation as being this horrible invasive species causing massive amounts of destruction, but also like they suck. They're not even worth the bullet. Like you can't consume them. And so there's just a lot of like hate that goes into them. But the first time you sit, if you're a hunter and you actually watch a drove, the community, the family, the dynamics of those sentient beings interacting, it's like the sweetest, most beautiful thing. And it kind of melts your heart and changes that relationship and the dynamics to, hey, that is a sentient being.
Right.
There is a community. They are an expression of life.
Right.
And so I think that's a really awesome thing that you touched on.
Yeah, that's really cool.
But what about, so like challenge yourself with some of these undesirable insects. What about like, hey, you're no longer putting your NPK, like chemical fertilizer on the lawn. I imagine there's some level of like underlying lack of biology. And so it's like you take away that input, what's going to happen, like realistically?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually really important. And so when we do these transitions in agriculture at larger scales, we really do need to taper off those inputs and slowly be introducing biology, knowing that like we'll probably kill a lot of the new life that we're introducing to that environment. But slowly over time, if we keep doing both, we get to a point where you can wean off these chemical inputs, specifically the fertilizers. And so I just feel like that might be a little complicated for your average homeowner. So I would encourage someone to at least cut back, like consider how much you're using on the fertilizer. I stand by don't use pesticides and herbicides, or fungicides. But your fertilizers, if you feel uncomfortable about shocking the system and you're not going to be able to handle your grass going from this unnatural green, frankly, to something either deficient looking, it's not going to die. It really shouldn't die because as we get through the other health principles, you are going to be responding and replacing those nutrients with something. It just won't be this like immediate plant available nutrient. So cut back like at least half, and while you start introducing these other methods and slowly get to the point where you're no longer using those inputs. And the other thing I would say is maybe consider some of your neighbors who aren't using NPK and look at the color green of their grass and compare it to yours so that you know what an unnatural green looks like compared to what a reasonable like expectation is for how your lawn's going to. It's going to look beautiful. It just won't look like maybe what you're used to based on all of pumping in all of those fertilizers.
Sure. It won't look like photoshopped or
Yeah.
have some kind of weird filter on it.
Like high saturation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you're not even like, it sounds like you're not even a fan of like organic fertilizer or some kind of like more natural amendment. You're like, don't sweat that? I mean, is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, I think that there are some great organic amendments out there. One locally here in Central Texas that I'd be happy to share with people is MicroLife. I think that they get what we're talking about, like this movement and this transition to improving the biodiversity below and above ground, and their products are capable of helping you in that transition. They also happen to make a product that's like pelletized, which is what a lot of people are used to using, right, to spread fertilizer. So that can be an easier transition for folks. But yeah, when it comes to herbicide and pesticide, I really the North Star is to restore the ecosystem so there's enough biodiversity to handle those pests when they do crop up, or prevent pests from taking hold to begin with. So that's the North Star. Now, when a pest crops up, if you want to reach for an organic solution, I think that's much better. That's a stepping stone. That's much better than reaching for the conventional pesticide. Yeah.
Okay. So that's minimizing disturbance. Number one. Let's get to number two.
Okay, number two, keep soil covered. So that can be, God bless these builders. They're keeping the soil covered by throwing some sod on there for us, and we can keep using turf in that way. It's keeping soil covered. I'm not suggesting everyone pull out their lawn to plant other plants because the lawn is providing a soil cover. So that's one way to keep doing that in a yard for now. But it's also about spaces where you do have landscape beds or a tree, keeping that pretty well mulched. So a lot of people ask me, like, when's the best time to mulch? Like they're overthinking mulching, they're overthinking mulching materials. And so my advice is that mulch should, there's no right time of year necessarily. It just should always be mulched, and it should be degrading. If it's not degrading, then that means like there's really no life there. So you need to up your level of introducing more microbiology to the soil system, which we can get into. But you want to see it degrading, so you want to be topping it off every couple of months in your landscape beds or around trees. Yeah.
So what's how does the value of keeping your soil covered in the summer compare to in the winter? Like, what are the benefits, or what can you see side by side with bare soil in each season?
Yeah. So with some of my neighbors that don't keep up with their mulching practices, what I see on their soils is like this hydrophobic layer. And so when it rains, it actually is a lot harder for the soil to absorb that water because all of the soil life that is exposed to the elements will end up just becoming like desiccated, and it creates a hydrophobic layer. So that's kind of like the science of it. When you're looking at bare soil, it's not just that it's dry. Like sometimes it's actually waxy and repelling water. So that can really make a big difference in your watering habits and water bill.
Yeah, that's insane. I know exactly what you're talking about. I've seen it, and it's like you can have a shovel and go over that spot that you're talking about that's hydrophobic, and it's like, good luck digging a hole. And like a foot over where there's coverage, totally different physical response to a shovel in the ground. Like one has structure, one is perceivably living, and then the other is just like concrete.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the soil crust, or even like, especially if you're irrigating that bare soil still, a lot of times I'll see like algae and mosses growing. That's a natural thing that's taking place, but those can also, when they dry out, they make it really waxy and hydrophobic. Yeah.
The other really good thing about mulch, let's be honest, is that you get to get country strong.
Yeah.
I've seen you get like a truckload delivered in your driveway, and I was like, I know how she's going to spread that mulch.
Oh, yeah. And I also called in some friends for backup that time because I was like, I tried the first day to move as much mulch as I could, and I was like, I need backup. I need friends. So we communed around it, and that's how my friends really, like, they were thrilled that I called them to spend time that way, to help me move mulch. Was like an exciting thing.
That's how you know if you have good friends.
Yeah.
It's friends that want to move mulch.
Yeah. Not
friends that just want to go like be degenerates and
drink
go
beer.
downtown, and get in trouble.
Right.
That's great. Okay, so the other thing about mulch that kind of strikes me is relevant is like mulch is practically free. I mean, even seasonally, it's so like the cost of mulch, a lot of it's in the transportation of it to get to your house.
Right. It really is. Like the price per yard is really affordable. So if you have a truck, like just go pick it up. But otherwise, like you can get some delivered, and I just kind of stockpile sometimes on the side of my yard so that I can top off.
Hoarding.
Like I hoard mulch, and I use that to top off trees and like smaller beds and stuff. So yeah, you can. The other question was about like mulch materials, like what do I use to mulch? And that more comes up with small farmers. Like they have hang-ups about different mulch coming into the farm, which I understand. But for homeowners, just an aged wood mulch, something that's not dyed, something that's like,
point. Thank you.
Even if it's hardwood mulch, like things that had antimicrobial properties, like those things are still okay, I think. But if they're aged, it can help to feed the soil quicker.
Yeah. I've seen red mulch made out of rubber. Like,
oh my God,
I don't even know. There's tires they're grinding up.
Right.
Disgusting.
Right. Yeah. So I do have to be careful with mulch because I inherently just think like wood mulch. I think of wood chips and stuff, but there's so many things to choose from, even just at a landscaping store. So definitely don't get anything synthetic. And that's the thing. People reach for that stuff because they're like, well, I don't actually want it breaking down. Like I want it to just keep covering the soil and help retain moisture. But mulch is providing more than one service to us. It's providing the cover and retaining moisture, but it's also feeding the soil. We want it doing that.
Yeah. How do you tell if mulch is legit? You like to find that like white stuff growing around on it?
Yeah. If there's mycelium up in there, like that's cool. That's a good sign that it's breaking down, that biology is like in there.
How can someone, what does it look like? Like what is like the visual cue if you go to like your mulch yard or your garden store and you're like looking and sniffing around, like how can someone use their eyes, or like what does that mycelial network look like?
Yeah, I think if it's the mycelium will look like threads almost. So think of like the smallest thread that you could get at like a sewing shop. Like it's going to look like white, kind of white or creamy colored typically, and just be growing on little bits of the wood chips or even in clumps sometimes. If you actually see mushrooms growing in it, like that's good. A lot of people,
Nice.
homeowners, might freak out if they see mushrooms growing in their yard or mushrooms growing in a mulch pile that they are going to, and that's not a bad thing. Like most mushroom species are doing their job of just breaking down woody material, and that's going to be a good thing.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think what I love about these principles of soil health that you're going over here is like this is the architecture of nature, and covering your soil is like so obvious in natural settings that are functioning at a high level. And it's like, that's why deciduous trees are losing leaves, you know? Like
yes.
heading into fall. And
yeah, that's another good example of like how you can cover your soil is when the leaves fall, like either collect them and move them onto a landscape bed. You know, they will choke out grass, right? And so you may want that aspect, or you may still be in a phase where like you're trying to keep your grass and you're trying to manage it regeneratively. In that case, like collect those leaves, but do not put them at the curbside. I'm the weirdo that will steal it off your curbside and bring it home so that I can add it to my compost pile or use it just directly as mulch. Yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, keep soil covered.
Keep it covered.
Number 3, living root.
Living root.
Year round.
Mm-hmm. So living root is also technically keeping soil covered. So you can have maybe like a low growing, almost like a cover crop, but it's not an agricultural context. So you might just call that something else, like a seasonal, like an annual that's like low growing to keep a space covered. But regardless, like you just want to maximize photosynthesis. So like, again, kind of going back to the builder grade landscape that's installed, they usually do like a couple of boxwoods. They might throw in an invasive species inadvertently, like whatever, and like these ornamental species. And that's fine. They're all photosynthesizing. Maybe you can add that to your relationship, practice where you're sitting with an invasive species and trying to figure out how you feel about that. But maybe consider adding more plants to that space and really maximizing the amount of photosynthesis that's occurring there.
So if you have like your turf grass, that's the majority of your lawn, and you leave it in this like not invasive, but non-native species that typically I feel like they're mostly like warm season dominant.
Yeah.
But like, what do you do in the winter if you want to, like, you have like all this dormant grass, so you have a root and it's just sleeping, but like you're not necessarily pumping carbon into the system.
Right. So I do think the best thing that you can do is add like a winter rye. So
I love that.
Yeah, you'd have 2 grass species going at the same time, and one goes dormant as the other one starts growing. What's annoying about that is that you can kind of mow year round in that case, to keep up with the HOA regulations or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think having a living root and photosynthesis happening is going to serve the soil. It's a net positive where you're reducing your mowing practices ideally. And I frankly don't irrigate my lawn very much, especially if you start improving the health of the soil. You'll find that you don't have to irrigate it all that much. So if things start going dormant in the middle of the summer when it's really, really hot and like I don't want to run my water all the time, I just let it do that. Yeah.
And if it's a native species, it just comes right back, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like dead, start over.
Right.
What I really like about the winter rye suggestion, I mean, 2 things. It's extremely cheap for a seed. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know how you spread it, but before we even get there, I just think in general, in the South, winter grasses are so much more pleasant than summer grasses.
They really are, yeah.
Since they're so soft, like I just want to lay in them. I want to be grounded in them. Mm-hmm. And not a lot of people are planting them, but I also feel like it's almost more of a favorable growing season. Like
it is, yeah.
And so like we don't even perceive winter dormancy as an opportunity to grow something green. But yeah, how do you even get started? If say you have like a pretty thick turf grass, How do you interseed or introduce those annual seeds in the fall?
I think most people use a spreader to get like an even application. I personally like just doing it by hand. I have a small enough front yard that I can just do something like that by hand. So yeah, I think there's like you probably already have the tools based on what you've been doing to start using rye seed.
So easy.
Yeah.
So you're literally just spreading.
Yeah.
So you're like doing it in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Super easy.
Yeah. There's no excuse. So those tiny little ryegrass seeds find their way to the soil, even if it's pretty thick? Or like, what's the journey of that seed leaving the soil?
The journey of that seed, yeah. I mean, you would want to cut once your Bermuda grass, if like for the initial seeding event, like you might want to cut your Bermuda grass pretty low. And then I like to soak seeds like that and in like a compost extract and then apply it. So they're kind of inoculated. They've already like come into contact with water. So they've kind of got these signals that it's time to germinate. You can also water them in, which will help them move down to the contact of the soil and give them a chance to germinate.
So cool. What about, so I just feel like you have to do that. But what if you want to get fancy? What if you want to like do, I don't know, like more of a biodiverse mix?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, going into the winter, like what else could you maybe put in with the ryegrass?
Yeah, I've been playing around with Native American Seed is like a brand that you can buy seeds from, and they have prairie grass seeds. And so if you were able to do something like that, like I couldn't just willy-nilly do that in my front yard with my HOA rules, but I could have like a contained space that's like a little pocket prairie and do that as more of like a landscaped bed. Yeah. So my plan is to just continue reclaiming more and more of my lawn to turn into like a more like a landscaped area.
Yeah.
And my HOA seems to be fine with that. Like as long as it aesthetically, it looks like it's being cared for.
Right.
They don't care if it's lawn or if it's flowering plants,
That's cool.
Yeah.
What about all those like beautiful little pollinator friends that probably have resources in the warm season, but maybe are a little bit hungrier in the winter dormancy? Like what can you do for those guys on the principle of like having a green growing plant year round?
Right. I'm sure there's pollen flowers that are winter flowers. This is where my breakdown in plant species it starts happening. So I'm definitely not an expert in like even the turf grass species that we've been talking about. But biodiversity is the name of the game. Like if you get a mix that has both cold weather plants and warm weather plants, then that'll ensure that you have at least something flowering year round. So like for us, up until this most recent freeze, Lantana was still had lots of pollinators on it. And it was beautiful. And it was like one of the only things that was still flowering in the front for us, but all of the pollinators were on it. Yeah. So it was one of the few things around.
Amazing. I mean, I guess, the idea is it's all regionally contextual, maybe what flowering plant will thrive in your zone,
right,
your growing zone. But the point is like there is going to be something. So just find out, look that up. Or if it's January or December or February and like you're just walking your dog or going to a park and you see some like really pretty flowers, take note of what that is.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the species that you plant.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And on our walks, like in our neighborhood, on the areas that kind of border the spaces that haven't been excavated, I see what's growing there. Like, verbena is doing really well here. And I might even take like a little verbena and bring it back home and just seed, not seed my bed, but actually transplant one into my bed. And then I have verbena growing because I know it grows well here. I know the pollinators are using it right down the street.
Yeah, it's free.
Yeah, it's free.
That's awesome. Okay, so you touched about biodiversity. We kind of already like going to number 4.
Right. Yeah, that's number 4. Okay, so livestock integration.
Wait, did we do biodiversity? We did green growing plant.
Oh,
if there was anything else you wanted to touch on biodiversity, I didn't want to.
Oh yeah, we don't want to skip biodiversity, so we were talking about it, but I think when we get to like this last one, context, just to skip around a little bit, the context of a yard and what biodiversity looks like in a yard compared to pasture land, compared to a farm, like that's all going to look really different how you implement that. And I think adding ryegrass into your mix is a good way to honor biodiversity within the context of like an American lawn, right? And then you just take that like one step further. So this is kind of going back to like not criticizing yourself for not being able to implement this to perfection or to the most idealistic scenario, which would be to have a food forest in your backyard or your front yard, but to just take one win and then move on to the next one, right? So incorporating ryegrass is like a good thing that you could do to increase biodiversity, but then maybe like the next season you expand your landscape bed to incorporate even more native plant species there to support more pollinators year round, etc. Like it just kind of begets more and more opportunities to introduce new plant species.
I love that. Biodiversity is the name of the game.
Yeah.
In general, right? Like even in our lives and the food we consume or the information that we consume or the people that we hang out with and the ideas that we're exposed to, it just is so enriching in every way. So it's like that principle is illustrated. It's put before us every day in nature. When I think about biodiversity, I think about one thing that comes to mind is like the insect species. I know we kind of touched a little bit about like the undesirable insect species, like I don't know, fire ants,
right? Red
ants, black widows, scorpions. Those are the extreme examples. I think those are reincarnated souls who are just really naughty in their previous life, maybe.
Here to haunt us.
They're here to like learn a lesson.
Yeah.
But like in a functioning ecosystem, I've heard crazy stories like for every, desirable one species, it could like be a predator and consume like up to 1,400 undesirables. Like the dynamics are just so incredible. But when we nuke the whole system and we shut down the biodiversity, it's like, well, the most resilient critters are those undesirable, super resistant pests that come first, where we've already like eliminated all their apex predators.
Right. Yeah, they have a role to play. This is how I think about pathogens in agriculture. It's like if you're constantly disturbing the ecosystem, pests and pathogens are just doing their job of taking down that plant and returning that organic matter to the soil to build the conditions so that one day something could grow and there won't be pests and pathogens, right? So that's the only way that you build soil to get out of that transition phase. And going back to these neighborhoods that are excavated from the beginning, even if you have a pretty mature neighborhood, that was a really big disturbance to that whole ecosystem. So like what we found is that there's just a crap ton of spiders and black widows included, and like so many because I assume became like the apex predator in a lot of ways once all of the birds, because of the trees, were displaced, and lizards and frogs aren't able to live on these like scorched landscapes anymore. So my goal is to create the conditions where like birds do want to hang out, where lizards do want to hang out, frogs. Like think about what might consume these pests, right?
Yes. That's awesome. So we talked like plant diversity, kind of have green growing plants, like we talked a lot about grasses, but like what other categories of plants, whether it's like a legume, like how does that work? Or, like a broadleaf and root structures, like how does biodiversity of plant species impact the greater system?
Yeah. So this is where I really think of ecological succession. You have these plants that serve a role in like early succession, where with a disturbed landscape, you're going to have a lot of annual plants, which are beautiful. Like you got lots of flowers in annual plants, and they tend to reseed themselves, and typically prolifically. Like that's how they're designed, is to help cover a landscape really quickly after disturbance. And then you'll transition more as you continue nurturing and as you continue introducing more biodiversity to that landscape. The conditions will be right to grow like a more mid-succession plant, like a perennial grass or a perennial forb, like a small plant, some of which flower most of the year. So that's how I think of plant species is like, is this an early succession plant? Is this a mid-succession plant? Sometimes you'll see them growing side by side in in the same soil. So this isn't like in a vacuum, like it's not that you won't ever see mid-succession plants next to early succession plants. It's just kind of this theory to help guide us of like, what are we doing to inform the soil of like what plants we want growing.
Love it. So let's go to my favorite, number 5.
Number 5, livestock integration.
Yeah. I say animal impact, baby.
Yeah.
Exclamation mark.
Yeah.
Like you said, that's kind of sketchy to realistically put a bison in your yard.
Yeah.
So
not advisable.
But probably at one point, not in the distant past, 150 years ago, there might have been some kind of ruminant animal herd co-creating with that landscape as a keystone species. So like, how do you incorporate animal impact?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, like, what are the livestock doing on your land? Like, are they introducing nutrients? What do they do?
Yeah, I think of them as cycling fertility primarily, and then like that little bit of biological disturbance that stimulates plant growth, and then spreading seeds, increasing the biodiversity.
Yeah, that's all the stuff like we want to do in place of like in lieu of livestock. We want to take on that responsibility. And, that could mean being as literal as going out and getting animal manure to introduce in some capacity, whether it's like a manure-based compost or just manure that you're using in some capacity as part of your fertility program. But it also means aeration or grazing or cutting back plants periodically. There's this kind of mistaken understanding that if you're just letting a plant do its thing and you're never pruning it, that's like the most wild state that plant could be in, and that's like the most ideal thing that you could be doing in a regenerative state of mind. But if you think about it, like plants are almost always feeding an herbivore of some kind. So pruning can be really helpful to the health of a plant and regenerating soil, actually, because it will strengthen that connection. Usually when you prune, there's like root stimulation. And so that feeds the underground too.
So the pruning mimics the bite of the ruminant. But then what happens when you over prune? Because we all know what happens when you overgraze.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Same idea. Like you don't want to cut a plant back. You also don't want to cut a plant back during really stressful times. So like thinking about, this is something that I couldn't really know not being a rancher, on the land watching their habits every day. But I'm guessing that bison aren't, grazing in the middle of the hottest time of day. So like you probably don't want to be pruning during the hottest time of day, because that's going to really make that plant struggle to regenerate itself.
Yeah, good point. I like that. Let me ask you something. I feel like we're on the same wavelength about stuff, and I just want your unbiased opinion. But okay, so like when you think about manure, like compost with manure in it, not all manure is created equal, but are you pro, neutral, or anti-biosolid, human biosolids?
I'm very, very skeptical of biosolids.
See, I knew we were on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
Okay.
I won't say that it can't be done right. But odds are, considering how messed up just our average industrial compost is, like I am not blindly going to trust anyone making a biosolid compost. Yeah, I think it could be handled well, but like we have a lot of reformation to go through with just our composting industry. Yeah.
Have you ever looked? So I guess for those that don't know what biosolids are, can you explain that? But also, have you looked at anything like that under a microscope?
That's a good question. I don't think I have actually. No, I've had some peers that have looked at it. But yeah, it's, to my understanding, it's biosludge, which comes from like wastewater treatment. So it's human manure and waste that has to go somewhere, ends up being biosludge at the water treatment facility. And then it's this, really dense organic matter, like probably has a lot of carbon in it. And there's this market, I think this has also gone throughout history, like people trying to figure out what to do with that waste. And like, because it could be so useful. Of course, in modern times, the concerns are around all of the things that we intake, whether it's the pesticide-laden food that we're actually eating or the pharmaceuticals or whatever that end up in our waste.
Totally right.
And the concern about like what does that mean if we're returning that stuff to the land? But I think that there's ways to deal with it responsibly and potentially incorporate it into a regenerative model. I just don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. I think humans have the capacity to be regenerative beings when they change their behavior. But kind of back to some of the earlier conversation, like starting with adopting regenerative principles in your own life. If right now as a species, our waste, our manure is fucking toxic, that is probably a pretty decent representation of our current state as regenerative beings or not. Because like every other species in a healthy, normal context, it's like that is just cycling fertility, going back and feeding biology. But yeah, I'm concerned about the same things you are: hormones, forever chemicals, and then all the other stuff that you know about under the microscope, nematodes.
Yeah. Talk about lack of biodiversity. Compost, a lot of compost that we have access to as homeowners, especially, even in farming and agriculture, it's lacking biodiversity. So I'd say like the number one thing to be concerned with when you're transitioning away from these chemical heavy synthetic fertilizers and trying to find something that's going to replace that and do a really good job of helping the soil regenerate itself, it boils down to finding really good quality compost and making sure that it's biologically active. And most of the compost that we would go buy at a big box store or purchase from a local composting facility, it's just not truly biodiverse compost. It's what I would call GOM, ground up organic matter. And it's not doing us many favors. So that's like the biggest advice that I would have for homeowners of finding a really good quality compost.
I think that's important, and it's like resonating with me. And so how do you know though, like, if you're not Andie Marsh level skill set with the microscope, how do you know if your compost is legit or if it's just industrial greenwash, ground up organic matter?
Yeah, I think there's a series of questions that you can ask a compost producer to really find out. So the questions that I would ask, I like to start with a really technical question, and I don't expect anyone to be able to answer it at a composting facility, but I think it's important to ask these questions because it's what's going to make them aware that there's a consumer base that's concerned with something as technical as a fungi to bacteria ratio, right? So that's something that I hope that in 10 years, every composter is at least aware that they should know what their fungi to bacteria ratio is. Like, I hope that becomes a norm in the industry.
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen if consumers are just like blindly buying their product and not asking these types of questions.
Sure.
So yeah, even if the consumer doesn't really know what that means, which I talk a lot about that on my Substack, is just kind of informing people like what these ratios mean and why you should ask people about them. That if you call and you ask them and they don't even know what you're talking about, then that can be, to use your term, a yellow flag. And then you can ask a question like, well, tell me what feedstocks go into your compost. And if they say something like, well, landscaping crews drop off their land waste and we put it through a shredder and then we manage these piles, make sure they get up to regulation temp, and then we move it out the door. That is just ground up organic matter. It's not incubating any life.
Sure.
So that's the big difference. And you don't need a microscope to really be able to know that ground up organic matter is going to be pretty bleak, like pretty like low biodiversity. It's mostly bacteria, which is a characteristic of really disturbed soils that we're trying to regenerate. So once you see that you're buying more bacteria-laden substrate and adding it to bacteria-rich soil, it stops making sense, and you can start asking these kinds of questions to your compost producer.
So, I mean, just kind of like touching on the compost topic, I think it's anyone that has a home, or even maybe it'd be harder with an apartment, but like this is another opportunity where you can cycle nutrients from your own waste, like food scraps. And I guess probably most people would be a little bit intimidated to just go out on a whim and start composting in their backyard, or they wouldn't know where to begin, or they would just do it terribly wrong. So like, what is your advice to getting people started there?
Yeah. Well, let me say, backyard composting, the odds of you doing better than what you're getting at an industrial compost are like pretty high. So like if you just heap together like rotting food and you more or less have 50% browns and 50% greens, like you're probably going to get a better product, a more biodiverse compost than you are if you just buy from the big guys.
Dang.
Yeah.
You made it sound so simple. But okay, so like 50% greens, 50% browns, just like high quality food waste. But like what do you do?
Yeah. Well, we're gonna go deep on this at the conference, aren't we? We're gonna get our hands dirty. So it's more about, I think with anything that you're starting new, it's about convenience, so that you actually show up and do the thing that you're responsible for, and just paying attention, like observation. So those are the two things, like early on in trying to establish this kind of like intimidating project, that I would encourage you to just like consistently show up to the project site. Make sure that site's like pretty convenient for you to visit. Like don't put it on the very back of your property. It really shouldn't smell or attract pests if you have like enough carbon in there. So that's one thing to know, is that like a lot of people get scared about like, oh no, like are there going to be rodents, or am I going to attract? And those are very real things that could happen. But like, get curious. Like, is it really the worst thing if you find a mouse in your compost pile? You know what I mean? It's a totally natural thing to happen. It doesn't mean that they're moving into your attic and like here to stay, right? And then it's also a signal to you that like you can start adding more quote unquote browns. I just use that term because you see that a lot in the homeowner composting world, is browns and greens. And that generally refers to carbons and nitrogen rich inputs. So carbon rich inputs are going to be like leaves, wood chips, paper, cardboard, those kinds of things. And that will generally keep pests away if you have like a layer of that, like pretty thick over your rotting food. So that can help minimize a lot of the intimidation factor. And just go out there and like poke around in it and get to know the pile. You don't have to worry. I just really don't encourage people to get like super scientific unless that's their thing. Like if they're an analytical type and they want to make a spreadsheet for their compost pile, like go for it. I'm one of those weirdos that likes to do that. I will record the temperature and the moisture and stuff. I'm also doing like thermophilic composting, which is more technical, and but average backyard composting, it's going to heat up, it's going to cool down, you're going to wet it. Like it's more of an art than a science, I think.
Yeah. That's so good. So I just feel like you've gone over so much potential in the urban setting, people with lawns, or even, I mean, like thinking about outside the box. Like how do these principles that we talked about impact you, even if you just have like a balcony porch and you can maybe grow some vegetables, or a potted plant inside your house? Like how can you think about what we talked about today and incorporate it into that single potted plant by your bed? That's cool stuff. But I guess to just kind of like summarize it, where do you begin? Like what's the first step? Maybe if you're just like intimidated, like, oh, there's these 6 principles, like what Andie, tell me what to do first. I just need you to nudge me, shove me in the right direction to start.
Yeah, I actually wrote down easy and the next level, like as my 2 categories of where you could begin. So the easiest thing that you could start doing to just incorporate regenerative principles into your life, and these will carry over to practices that you try, like composting, like gardening. I would start with a sit spot practice. And that's something that Jared Holmes introduced.
Sounds like a Jared thing.
Yeah. Field biologist Jared Holmes. That's just sitting in the same spot every day. It can be as little as 5 minutes, but you're outside. It's in your like immediate surroundings. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to go to a park. Like you just sit in your yard, preferably like having contact with the ground, and get curious. And if you need more of a more structure than just like sitting there in your lawn, I get that. That is even an intimidating thing to someone. Maybe pick one plant in your surroundings and like you go visit that plant every day and do this as, daily, but as long as you can. And that'll really inform like how to start being in your environment regularly. It will start feeling less intimidating to go outside and like interact with your own yard. I think a lot of people outsource this stuff because it just feels uncomfortable. It feels like this responsibility that doesn't fit into the fabric of their busy lives. And that's why you hire landscaping crews and stuff. But even if you're in that state, going out and visiting with that one dandelion like every day can make a big difference.
Yeah. I love it. That's a wonderful start. Last question. We started asking people this, but what is where does hope grow for you?
Ooh, I like that. Hope grows for me at home in my daily life. I think, there's so much content out there and sources of inspiration, and that can be a really beautiful thing. But if I'm not taking that in and then applying it just to my little single life, at the dinner table, in my own environment, surrounding my house, then I'm not part of the movement. So I think the hope really lives with the little changes that I get to make in my daily life and looking back how those add up over time.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Andie. It's always amazing seeing you.
Yeah.
I hope I see you again before the conference, but if not, I am so going to be like front row paying attention to the composting course that you are teaching. It's like one of the highlights of the event. So I'm sure people are going to just be so fascinated by your work and look you up after this episode. But thank you for all your grace and your giving nature, for sitting with us today, and all the beautiful writing you're doing. And I encourage everyone to go and follow you on Substack.
Thank you. It's called Soil is Sexy.
It is sexy. That's how you know you're my people.
Yeah. And we're having fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Taylor.
Yep. Bye.